Discussion questions. 1. Why is it perhaps socially desirable for governments to provide subsidies to opera or ballet companies? 2. Explain why strategic preemption, proliferation, or specification do not mean that all differentiated product markets are always monopolized. 3. The acquisition of Kraft's Post subsidiary of Nabisco's RTE branded cereals, including its shredded wheat cereals, in 1992 raised the HHI by 66 points to 2281. Post merger, HHI above 1800 is considered highly concentrated in the U.S. merger guidelines, and mergers in industries with HHI above 1800 that increase the HHI by between 50 and 100 points potentially raise significant competitive concerns, depending on other factors. What other factors would you take into consideration? How might the following matter, localized versus general competition in RTE breakfast cereals? 2. Competition between Nabisco's and Kraft's brands in the RTE breakfast cereals. 3. Easy supply side substitution, switching of productive capacity from one product to another. 4. Evidence of rivalrous non-price competition, advertising new brands, etc. And 5. Evidence of extensive discounting and difficulty verifying wholesale prices. 4. What is the effect on localization in the hoteling linear city with price competition if transportation costs are linear or concave? They increase with distance but at a constant or decreasing rate. 5. Von Hohenbalken and West, 1986, argue that for the period 1968 to 1982, the data are not consistent with Safeway engaging in preemption. They reached this conclusion by comparing the average market size of all stores with the average market size of Safeway's new stores. They argue that if Safeway is engaging in preemption, then the average market size of a new store should be less than the average market size of all existing supermarkets. Explain why this is true. Ceteris paribus. Then explain what might have changed over this period to make this simple comparison misleading. 6. Explain why competition between sports leagues would mitigate the following problems. 1. Escalating player salaries. 2. Revenue and competitive imbalance between large and small market teams. 3. Request for public monies to fund stadiums and arenas. Problems. 1. Assume that consumers are uniformly distributed along a 1-mile stretch of beach. A number of ice cream vendors are pondering where to position their carts. If the price they are allowed to charge is fixed, but the equal access to coolness for all coalition show that there is no Nash equilibrium if the number of ice cream vendors is 3. 2. Find all the equilibrium locations if there are 5 firms competing over locations in the hoteling linear city. Product space is the unit interval. Prices are fixed. And there is uniform distribution of consumers' tastes. 3. For the case in which there are 6 firms competing over locations in the hoteling linear city, find the equilibrium locations when the distance between the two most interior firms is A 1/8, B 1/4, C 0. 4. Find all of the equilibrium locations to the hoteling linear city when there are 6 firms competing over locations. 5. In Balzac, there are only 2 TV stations. At a certain time, each has the choice of broadcasting a dinosaurs hockey game or the Royal Canadian Ballet. 70% of the viewers want to watch the hockey game. 30% want to watch the ballet. Want to see the ballet. Each would rather have their fingernails removed than watch the alternative program. If both stations show the same program, they split the audience evenly between them. If maximizing profits means maximizing viewing audience, what programs will the two stations broadcast? Is the market equilibrium efficient? Why? 6. A county consists, for all intents and purposes, of 2 towns, right and left. Each has 1/3 of the population. The remaining 1/3 lives uniformly scattered on the one straight road that connects the 2 towns. Everyone is an imbiber. Jim Beam and Jack Daniels own the only 2 liquor licenses. Each drinker will go regularly to whichever bar is closest to him. Unfortunately for Jim and Jack, Auntie Temperance has convinced the powers that be that if these 2 gentlemen were unregulated, they would conspire to raise prices. The resulting hardship would be intolerable. Hence, the price of a drink in each bar is equal and determined by the government. The only variable that Jack and Jim would have control over is their location. A. What is the appropriate definition of a Nash equilibrium for this location game? B. Find the Nash equilibrium locations of the 2 drinking establishments. C. If we reinterpret location as type of product, how would you expect the 2 drinks to taste vis-a-vis each other? What does this say about the market's ability to provide a variety of products? D. Are the Nash equilibrium locations likely to be the socially optimal ones? E. Suppose instead that 1/8 of the population lives in each of the 2 towns, with the remaining 3 quarters distributed uniformly between the 2 towns. If there are 4 taverns, what is the symmetric Nash equilibrium in locations? 7. Consumers' preferences are uniformly distributed on the unit interval. Firms enter sequentially, and their costs of entry are sunk. Prices are fixed such that open parentheses P minus C close parentheses equals 1. A. Suppose that capital M equals 1 and F equals 1/8. Find the free entry number and location of firms. B. Suppose that M equals 2 and F is equal, capital M equals 2 and F equals 1/8. Find the free entry number and location of firms. C. Suppose that capital M equals 1 and F equals 1/4. Find the free entry number and location of firms. D. For each part A to C, find the critical value for K, assuming linear transportation costs that determines if there are too few or too many brands. 8. Consumers' preferences are uniformly distributed on the unit interval. Prices are fixed such that open parentheses P minus C close parentheses equals 1, and the number of consumers has been normalized to 1. Firms enter sequentially and incur a startup cost of 1/6. Suppose that startup costs are not sunk. Firms can costlessly relocate. What is the free entry number and location of firms? Hint, the equilibrium to the game in which firms enter sequentially but fixed costs are not sunk is the same as an alternative game in which firms simultaneously choose their locations but fixed startup costs are sunk. In the simultaneous location and entry game, we can find the Nash equilibrium by separating the location and entry decisions. First, find the equilibrium to the location game with a fixed number of firms. The outcome of the location decisions and game determines the profitability of entry. 9. Show that a monopolist with one product at the left endpoint would find it profit maximizing to serve the entire market when transportation costs are quadratic in the linear city if capital V is greater than or equal to 3K. Problem requires calculus. 10. Suppose that consumers are uniformly distributed on the unit interval and that the only locations where a firm can locate are at the endpoints. Suppose further that transportation costs are quadratic and capital V is greater than or equal to 3K. As usual, that open parentheses P minus C close parentheses equals 1 and that the number of consumers has been normalized to 1. So that for 3K over 4 is greater than F, which is greater than K over 4, a monopolist would provide products at both end points, but the efficient solution is for a single product. Explain why the monopolist has excessive incentives to introduce the second product. 11. Judd, 1985, considered the preemption model in the hoteling linear city. Suppose that there are little or no exit costs associated with withdrawing a product. Argue that in these circumstances, brand preemption might be credible. Why might a situation result in predatory entry? Is the predation socially inefficient? 12. Circle model, Scallop, 1979. Consider firms locating on a circle of unit circumference, say 1 mile. Consumers are distributed uniformly around the circle, and each buys 1 unit of the good from the firm charging the lowest delivered price. There are 200 consumers. Costs are made up of 1. A fixed cost per firm of capital F equals 4. 2. A marginal cost of production equal to 1 per unit. And 3. Transport costs, delivery costs of 2 per unit distance per unit of the good. In the market, firms set a mill price, and the price set a mill price, the price at the factory. Delivered prices are equal to the mill price plus transport costs. Problem requires calculus. A. What is the density of consumers around the circle? How many consumers would reside in a circle segment with a length of 1 over open parentheses 2 capital N close parenthesis miles? B. Find the socially optimal number of firms. Firms can also be interpreted as number of products. C. What would the socially optimal number of firms What would be the socially optimal number of firms if capital F equals 0? What does this suggest about the likelihood of capital F equals 0? What is the role of capital F in determining the optimum number of firms, the delivery costs? D. Find the Nash equilibrium number of firms' products if they are distributed at equal intervals around the circle, and the Nash equilibrium price in the market if there is simultaneous free entry. E. Find the subgame perfect number of firms and the price charged in the market if firms enter sequentially and the location costs are sunk. Suppose location costs are not sunk. Redo. E. (13) The utility function of a representative consumer is capital U equals open parentheses the summation of x sub I to the power of 1/2 close parentheses squared. The demand function for good I is x sub I equals capital I over open parentheses p squared sub I, or I could say p sub I squared q close parentheses, where q is equal to the sum of p sub I to the power of -1. And capital I is income. The cost function for product I is capital C equals C x sub I plus F. Firms are Bertrand competitors. A. For fixed number of brands, capital N, find the symmetric equilibrium price in the large group case. In the large group case, firms treat Q as exogenous. Hence, D x sub I over d p sub I equals -2 capital I p sub I to the power -3 q to the power of -1. B. Find the free entry number of firms for the large group case. C. For fixed number of brands, capital N, find the symmetric equilibrium price and quantity in the small group case. In the small group case, firms internalize the effect of P sub I on Q. Hint, the derivative of x sub I with respect to P sub I equals, or I can say dx sub I over dp sub I equals -2 capital I p sub I to the negative third power q to the power of negative 1 plus capital I p sub I to the power of negative 4 q to the power of negative 2. D. Find the free entry number of firms for the small group case. E. Compare the equilibrium price and variety of the small and large group cases. 14. Suppose that the gross utility of a representative consumer is capital V equals capital N to the power 1/2, where capital N is the number of products. Their net utility, capital U, equals capital V of capital N minus capital P equals capital N to the power 1/2 minus capital P, where capital P is the equilibrium price when there are capital N firms. Suppose that capital P equals 1 over capital N, so that as the number of firms increases, the equilibrium price falls. Marginal cost of production is 0, but each firm incurs a fixed cost equal to F. The marginal benefit of another variety firm is D capital V over D capital N equals 1 over open parentheses 2 times the square root of capital N close parentheses. The number of consumers is normalized to 1. A. What is the socially optimal first best number of firms? B. Assuming that the market share of each firm when there are capital N firms is 1 over capital N. What is the free entry number of firms? C. Compare the socially optimal number of firms with the free entry number. When is there excess variety, insufficient variety, and why? 15. Suppose that the gross utility of a representative consumer is capital V equals capital N to the power of 1/2. Where capital N is the number of products. Their net utility is capital U equals capital V of capital N minus capital P equals capital N to the 1/2 power minus capital P, where capital P is the equilibrium price when there are capital N firms. Suppose that capital P equals 1 over capital N, so that as the number of firms increases, the equilibrium price falls. Assume that firms divide the market equally. Marginal cost of production is 0, but each firm incurs a fixed cost equal to F equals 0.64. Normalize the number of consumers at 1. Suppose that alpha consumers belong to a buyer group and K is the percentage of firms that belong to a seller group. A. What is the monopolistically competitive price and equilibrium number of firms? B. Suppose that the buyer group is offered a requirements contract uh, by the seller group for a price capital P sub I. Under what circumstances would they accept the deal, assuming the number of firms is fixed at the free entry monopolistically competitive number? C. What are the profits of the seller group if the requirements contract is accepted? Assuming the number of firms is fixed at a free entry, monopolistically competitive number? D. What are the aggregate benefits to the two coalitions from the requirements contract? Is the collective contract a potential Pareto improvement from the perspective of the two coalitions when K equals 0.10, K equals 0.90? What is the minimum value of K for the collective contract to be a potential Pareto improvement for the two coalitions? Assume that the number of firms is fixed at the free entry monopolistically competitive number. E. For this and all following parts, assume the following. 1. F is not sunk and the number of firms can adjust. And 2. That K equals 0.1 and alpha equals 0.99. Show that the profits of a firm not included in the seller coalition are negative. What happens in the long run to the number of firms? F. What is the aggregate increase in profits for firms in the coalition? G. Does the requirements contract increase the joint surplus of the two coalitions? Would it be for these parameter values if the number of firms was fixed? H. Is the requirements contract socially efficient in the long run? Why?